Here is the village of Bellows Falls in all its glory. Well, you can't see all its glory from this distance, but it's a small place. A strip about a mile long, squeezed between a mountain and a river. One of the most heavily policed areas I've ever lived in. Now, now we're recording.
All right, so why I think 80s films are paced out perfectly, and in addition to that, that's when they also, when special effects and the quality of the film stock, kind of reached its pinnacle. I mean, I know the quality gets, better and better, but so during the 80s, during the 60s and 70s, the film business was declining because they were competing heavily with television, and so they did the wide they were practicing with wide aspect ratio and cinescope in the 50s and the 60s, but then they started doing the wide aspect ratio, and the home video market came. So you have a little smaller screen, so your films have to be paced out a little bit faster than you than when you're then in the cinema. If you're going to watch a movie, prior to the 80s, the films were paced out slower, and the result of home video and that additional market, I think they came to like the sweet spot in pacing for feature films, and that's why I believe the 80s films are some of the best, the best films, and the best filmmakers came out during the 80s, and so on and so forth, because and I was going to say before, you'd get similar paced films in the 1930s, just when sound came around, because when sound, you had the silent film era, so, and actually they sort of honed in the craft of filmmaking during the silent film era, and you had like some really great action, really nicely paced out films, and then sound came in, and that changed the way you could move the camera because you had to deal with sound. And so they did start off with sort of radio-based type of feature films that were really fast, quick, and witty, and it was all based on the dialogue and the audio. And so they were pretty quick, but then as the filmmaking progressed, the filmmaking got slower. It got slower because they learned how to move the camera, they learned how to integrate sound. It moved away from sort of kind of radio pacing, and I would have to say, the 40s and 50s were probably the slowest filmmaking that was out there. So,
how would you describe the difference between the 70s and the 80s?
Well, I mean, the 70s I think are a little bit, there was a lot more experimental filmmaking going on during the 70s. The blockbuster hadn't come to fruition yet, and so the films were experimental, but they were a little bit slower, I think. They just were, I don't know, not as entertaining. But that's my theory.
Well, I should call them both Alien and Aliens, and Alien was 1979, and Aliens was 1986. And the first one, when I rewatched it, I was almost shocked at how little plot there is. It's very slow, it's very atmospheric, not much happens. And then Aliens,
Yeah,
it's just
totally
a mile a minute, and it's jam-packed with plot. And in fact, they had to cut out some fairly significant plot points for the theatrical release.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely see the pacing change. It's also filmmaker style, but Ridley Scott has always been, especially with the sci-fi, with Blade Runner, has always had a slower sort of atmospheric. Look at this wide shot. Let's hold on it. That filmmaking is very specifically done for the theater. And so, yeah, I think you do see that change, like you said. I mean, Cameron's a different filmmaker. He's a quicker pace, a little bit more plot. But, there's also the home video market, and I think that had a huge, significant impact in pacing of the films. And then after the 80s, they just went into the mid-90s, into the 90s, it just started getting really, really fast and almost just jarring, and to the point where it's like there's no Goldilocks zone in a lot of these films. They're paced out super duper fast for a short attention span, and doesn't quite necessarily work well on a big screen when you just got like machine gun bullet shot. Michael Bay is the classic example in all his films. It's just like, and it's like you get no time to kind of step into the scene. So, and this isn't every film. This is just a generalization of where I feel like the pacing of films have gone. I think they're coming back now to a more reasonable pace. But I think the 80s hit that Goldilocks zone, and a lot of filmmakers were, right on. That was kind of the standard, in terms of pacing. So
now, a film that came out last year that the mainstream media desperately wanted to fail was Joker.
Yep.
And Joker very deliberately mimics the cinematic style of like Scorsese's 1970s, Taxi Driver and Mean Streets, things like that. I remember the weekend that it was coming out, I heard on multiple news outlets that they were expecting shootings in the theater, and they were advising people not to go.
It only helped the film. I mean,
but it's not a big budget film. It didn't have many special effects. There's no CGI doubles for stunt work, things like that. It was in camera sort of film.
Yeah.
And it made a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
What does that tell you about what audiences are actually hungry for?
Well, they want good story that's paced out properly with good performances, and they were able to, the reason why it was successful is, one, because they were able to just put the skin of the DC Batman franchise over a film that just put that skin over and tell a dark story, about a guy with a mental illness and going psychotic, So it could have been, if you didn't have the Joker in there, it still would have been a good film. They just put that skin on there to get a younger generation who are used to just going to seeing movies, tentpole films, that are based upon comic books or science fiction, and was able to kind of open up a newer, open the eyes to a younger audience, or people, to type of filmmaking that was done in the 70s and 80s, because Scorsese is a great filmmaker. His films have always been paced out pretty evenly too. I mean, he's a part of that generation, that sort of pushed filmmaking along and found that Goldilocks zone in the 80s. I mean, even though he did a lot of films in the 70s, but him, Spielberg, De Palma, the list goes on. Those were all part of the same boomer class of filmmakers who loved television, and loved the serials of television, loved the sci-fi on television. And I'm sure when they were kids, when they were watching these older films on their television, they had all these critiques about maybe they were running a little bit too slow for the television. The special effects needed to be updated, and so all those guys, because of the technology came around, all those filmmakers wanted to remake their favorite films when they were children that they watched on television and do a better job.
Yeah.
So.
George Lucas wanted to do Buck Rogers.
Yeah. Yep.
In fact, he wanted the rights to that property, and when he couldn't get it, he had to make do. He basically stole Dune and made Dune without calling it Dune.
It wasn't Buck Rogers. I think it was
Flash Gordon.
It was Flash Gordon.
Yeah, you're right. It was Flash Gordon.
It was Flash Gordon. Yeah, he wanted to do Flash Gordon.
But he wanted to do, a serialized, with the crawl, the text crawl summarizing what happened previously, and yeah. So instead he couldn't get that, so he went and basically made Dune and crossed it with a Western and a samurai film and little World War II dogfight at the end, and there you go. There's Star Wars.
Yeah, and they were kids, and when the television was coming into being, and so they had the serialized content, but they also displayed those in the theaters and on television, and they were a speedier paced form of storytelling. So I think a lot of those filmmakers took a lot of cues from that in the 80s, and that's how you got your blockbuster. I mean, Hitchcock, Spielberg, sort of like quickened the pace of, Hitchcockian filmmaking. I mean, with Jaws, and what was his first film about the trucker?
Duel.
So, because you know, Hitchcock's a great filmmaker, but you know, he was a man of his era and what people were used to. But his films, I mean, you watch them today and they're great, but they're sort of their pace, they're very slow. You know what I mean? And I'm sure they're probably more engaging when you're sitting in the theater. You know, and you have the full, and he has your full attention. But you know,
Films also used to have intermissions.
Yep.
Basically, the built-in smoke break.
Yep. Intermissions. Yep. So,
You are getting savagely eaten by mosquitoes, so I will turn off the camera and you can turn your full attention to battling the mosquitoes.